international law. The court was interpreting the existing law and determining what that law means. So it amounts to an authoritative determination of what that law means by the most distinguished jurists globally.
I want to make sure I get this right. The binding versus non-binding, because when I interview people who speak in defense of Israel, and I bring up this advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice, invariably they tell me, oh, that's non-binding.
Yes.
The inference being, it doesn't need to be respected.
Well, the law needs to be respected. The law that the court determined, the meaning of which the court determined in the advisory opinion needs to be complied with.
You opened your presentation, your statement, by saying Palestinians have been denied self-determination through, and I quote, a more than century-long violent, colonial, racist effort to establish a nation-state exclusively for the Jewish people in the land of mandatory Palestine. When you say racist, is that a legal determination or is that a political statement?
In international law, racial discrimination is unlawful, and in general. And then a particular regime of domination by one group over another in a system of government and authority on the basis of racial domination is also unlawful as apartheid.
You used the word apartheid.
Yes.
In your arguments. The court, in its advisory opinion, did not. What is the finding there?
The court clearly established that there was a violation of the relevant areas of international law without expressly referencing apartheid as a violation, but nonetheless covering that without mentioning it in terms. Likewise, when it came to aggression.
In my reading of the opinion, they did call it discrimination, though. Discrimination, and then they didn't specify whether it was racial, religious, or ethnic. But in the way I read the opinion, it's one of those three. It's discrimination on one of those three grounds.
So the way that we can understand the court's decision is based on the arguments that were put before it, which were all rooted in not only religious discrimination, which is also the situation, but also discrimination on the grounds of race.
Now, if I try to cross-examine you, I'm not going to be very successful. I'm not a top-flight international lawyer. But what I can do is I have read Israel's legal arguments that would put forward by the Israeli ambassador. It's one-sided, because it overlooks
there is only one
victims
side
of
dominating the other. The Palestinians are not occupying Israeli land. So by definition, if the court's going to be considering the question of domination, it isn't going to be needing to address any issue of the other side.
Peacemaking has been scuttled on various occasions by the Palestinians themselves.
Irrelevant to the issue of whether Israel has a right to dominate the Palestinian people. That's a non sequitur. That's introducing a consideration that has no bearing on the question of whether one racial group has a right to dominate another.
Israel has a duty to protect its own citizens.
Again, irrelevant to the question of occupying Palestinian territory. Yes,
Israel
a duty to protect, but not a duty to protect which involves the indefinite subjugation of an entire other racial group.
Israel has valid, long-standing historical ties to the land.
No. Legally, no. Legally, no. I mean, that's the claim. It doesn't have any legal foundation. In the League of Nations a covenant that was part of the Versailles Treaty, the Palestine Mandate was supposed to be provisionally recognized as an independent state, a state for everyone, a single state for all the people on that land, not a state for a particular racial group. So the idea, and Israel is a Jewish state by definition, and there is no legal basis for a specifically Jewish state on that land in international law.
What is or would be Israel's strongest argument before a court of law?
For what? To dominate Palestinians? There is no argument for committing genocide. I mean, what needs to be justified?
These come up often when I interview people who speak in defense of Israel.
Okay, self-defense.
Thank you.
Okay.
You took the words out of my mouth. This is the first thing that comes up.
Yes. So let's go back to 1967. So why is Israel there? There was a war between Israel and three of its neighbors. Israel started that war, and it was a war started preemptively, illegally, because states cannot use force lawfully in non-immediately imminent anticipatory self-defense. As a result of that illegal war, Israel captures the territory. It has no right, a state has no right to retain control over territory simply for security purposes. And the right of self-defense, therefore, is inapplicable to that kind of action. States have to deal with security threats non-forcibly when it comes to the extraterritorial use of force, unless they are at risk of an actual or an imminent attack. And Israel was not in 1967. It used force anyway. And of course, the clue is in the name. It was over in 6 days. There was no longer any threat. Insofar as there was a threat, it was removed through that action.
Well, they of course would disagree that there was no longer any threat. But what about in the context?
I don't think Israel would disagree that after the 6-day war, there was no then immediate threat of attack from the three Arab states. So Israel should have withdrawn at that moment. On the 7th day, there should have been a retreat, because there was no legal basis to maintain the control over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
What about in the context of Gaza today? And I'm taking you beyond, obviously, the remit of the ICJ's advisory opinion. But Israel today says more than ever that it is acting in Gaza in self-defense following the attacks by Hamas in Israel on October the 7th.
So Israel has been using force in Gaza since 1967, continuously. And on October the 6th, 2 years ago, Israel was already exercising military authority over Gaza, and, as I say, illegally. In that situation, when a state is using force illegally, if there is violent resistance to that illegal use of force, the state's use of force does not somehow then become lawful as a means of defense to that defense. There is no defense against defense.
If Israel hypothetically decided we want to be in full compliance with international law, what would it have to do?
In general, there needs to be an end to racial discrimination and the domination by one racial group over another from the river to the sea. It needs to be the return of all of the Palestinian people who were forcibly displaced and have been displaced from that land for a century. That's also a legal requirement.
Displaced since when? Are you talking 1948 or 1967?
No, since even before 1948, but certainly from the Nakba and 1947, 1948 and onwards. A legal right of return in international law that is vested in all of those people and their descendants. The remaining non-Jewish Palestinian people who were not forcibly displaced in 1948, but who are treated in various ways as second-class citizens within Israel, around 17% of the citizenry of Israel, that's unlawful. And that illegal discriminatory treatment that constitutes apartheid needs to end. There needs to be equality. And then when it comes to the extension of Israeli rule into the remaining 22% of mandatory Palestine, the West Bank and including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, there needs to be a complete withdrawal immediately, the removal of all settlements and settlers, and the provision of compensation to the Palestinian people for all of the harm that they have suffered since 1948.
This part gets lost in discussions about the advisory opinion. It does mention compensation?
Insofar as it addresses the 67 onwards, yes, the requirement of compensation as well as withdrawal.
So land that has been taken, again, according to international law, as it is laid out in this advisory opinion, land that has been taken from Palestinians by Israel since 1967 needs to be returned to them.
Yes.
And where that is not materially possible, they need to be...
No, there is no excuse for not returning the control of the land. So Israel doesn't have the option to maybe withdraw from some of the land and retain some of the land and then just provide compensation. That's not legally permissible. What I mean by compensation is compensation for all of the other loss suffered by the Palestinian people as a result of the unlawful occupation.
There are 15 judges at the International Court of Justice that rule
There were
on
then,
these,
yes.
that rule on these opinions. 15 judges had to decide, say yay or nay, essentially. They could provide a dissenting voice. But my point is, this decision was not close. The judges were overwhelmingly in favor of saying that Israel's presence in Palestinian territory is illegal and must end. This was not close.
It was not. And likewise, there was an overwhelming support in the UN General Assembly affirming the finding of the ICJ in all key respects.
So the UN General Assembly, which represents all the countries in the world, one country, one vote, passed a resolution at the UNGA demanding that Israel respect this advisory opinion, and that means demanding that within a year, Israel leave occupied Palestinian territory, cease all settlements, and remove all settlers. That was voted in September of 2024. So we're about...
The clock is ticking.
Yeah, the clock is ticking. Nobody thinks this is about to happen, and there are no signs that this is about to happen.
States were also told in the advisory opinion and in the General Assembly resolution that the illegality involved in the occupation has important consequences for them because of the fundamental nature of the rules of international law that are being violated. In international law, in a decentralized legal system where there is no global sovereign who can enforce the law, unlike in a national legal system, the role of individual states becomes much more important as agents of enforcement.
If you are any third party, not Israel, any other country in the world, whether it's the Fiji Islands, France, or Venezuela, how are you supposed to put yourself in compliance with that opinion and with international law?
First and foremost, they must take positive steps insofar as it's possible to bring the illegality to an end. And then they also have negative obligations not to recognize the illegal situation and also not to provide any aid or assistance to it.
Concretely, what does that look like?
Positive steps to bring the situation to an end would include sanctions against Israel, aimed at influencing Israel's behavior. Non-recognition involves states, for example, not doing anything when it comes to the diplomatic relations with Israel, which involves expressly or implicitly recognizing not only that Israel isn't sovereign over this territory, but even that Israel doesn't have any right to be there in the first place. So states should not be engaging in diplomatic relations with Israel. And so that includes, for example, the current practice of affirming that somehow a right of self-defense would justify Israel's continued presence. Any state who affirms that position is violating the duty that they have not to recognize the validity and the legality of Israel's presence in that territory.
But you're not saying that countries, for instance, are required by international law to shutter their embassies in Israel. That's not what we're talking about.
They should not have embassies or any diplomatic representation to Israel on occupied territory. For example, in East Jerusalem. They shouldn't even have diplomatic premises in Jerusalem at all, because the status of Jerusalem as a whole, not just East Jerusalem, but also West Jerusalem, still is to be determined. And Israel is not sovereign in West Jerusalem. Hence, most states who recognize Israel as a state do not have their embassies to Israel in Jerusalem, even in West Jerusalem, because of that legal requirement that they cannot recognize an invalid claim to sovereignty over that city.
What's international law good for if it doesn't protect people from abuses and doesn't work in the way it's supposed to or was invented and was dreamed up?
So it's a limited system.
The new
And the importance is not to make overblown claims for its potential, but not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that it is worthless. The better approach is modesty in the expectations one has for the significance of international law, which I think then should have consequences in terms of the extent to which time and effort should be spent utilizing legal avenues of redress as opposed to other avenues, which may include forcible revolutionary avenues.
Explain.
Actually, in international law, the Palestinian people have a right to resist, a right to defend themselves from their subjugation and oppression, and to do so violently if necessary. People are not, of course, cannot be expected to simply put faith in a system that is not protecting them and be prevented, because of the existence of that system, the ability to take matters into their own hands, including through violent means. So that's the challenge. If global society wishes to promote peace, then it has to enable justice.
You're saying if international law isn't strong enough or effective enough in guaranteeing people's rights, people will fight for those rights.
International law permits that, actually. So, for example, if we think about another situation, the right of self-defense that the people of a state might have. So if we think about the discussions around, for example, Russia's war in Ukraine, international law permits the right of self-defense. If the situation is dealt with peacefully and through the application of international law, then of course the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian state would not have a right to use force against Russia. The same logic applies to a non-state self-determination grouping of people, the Palestinian people, in an analogous situation.
So there is an argument that Israel makes, and the US sometimes makes it too. You're not going to like it. Which is, in essence, international law is getting in the way of resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. It is because it is getting in the way of diplomacy, politics, and deal-making. And that's where a solution is going to be found, in those arenas, not in international law. So, says Israel, so stop the lawsuits and engage in deal-making.
Yeah, but I think the question is, what is international law preventing when it comes to the issue of ending the subjugation of the Palestinian people? Nothing. But what international law is preventing is for Israel stealing more of Palestinian land. And that's why Israel doesn't like it. People within Israel or supporters of Israel are against international law, because international law is against Zionist domination on a racist basis of the Palestinian people and the theft of Palestinian land. So, of course, they're against international law. When it comes to deal making, when we drill down on the question of these supposed deals, what they usually involve is a further loss of the land of the 22% of Palestine that was left after the proclamation of the State of Israel in 1948, that Israel somehow wants even more of that land, like extending from 78% into some of that 22%. And the idea being that the Palestinian people, in rejecting that, are somehow impediments to peace.
Did you have any strong personal or political views about Israel-Palestine before you became invested in this as an international lawyer?
I think I approached the situation with an open mind, but also perhaps with a fairly typical European bias through the education that I'd had, which had not taught me anything about the situation and in general, or indeed it's more specifically the British role in it. Whereas I had been taught about the Shoah, about the Holocaust, and the one-sided nature of my education, I think, led to a situation where I had to educate myself. And what I uncovered was shocking in terms of the consequences for the Palestinian people of the establishment of the State of Israel and the role of the UK in that, and the role of other Western states in supporting it ever since.
Ralph Wilde, thank you for joining us on Center Stage.